Story 1. I think my cousin was replaced, and I think I know when it happened. I don't know what to do. To be honest, I wasn't sure that the advice sub would let me post this there, so I'm posting it here, because it's so fucked up. And it didn't seem right for Let's Not Meet either. But I do need advice, because I feel I'm losing my fucking mind. So I 30F have always been very close to my cousin 30F, let's call her Angela. Because we're the same age, our parents, my mom and her father, our siblings, went through all the same stages with us, and as such, we were more or less raised like siblings due to how much time our families spent together. We even had homes in the country in the same township, which is where I think this happened. And I can't really tell my family this, because it will make me sound legitimately crazy. And some part of me even doubts this memory. But at the same time, I know in my heart that it's true. It's a complicated feeling, and this memory was brought to light last week when my suspicion I've had for years was more or less confirmed. One winter, 16 years ago, when Angela and I were both 14, both of our families were at our cottages, a 20-minute drive from each other. Angela and her little brother, my cousin, let's call him James' parents, my aunt and uncle, were going skiing one morning, and I wanted to go too. So I spent the night at their cottage, like I often did when we all went up north. Angela's bedroom had 2 single beds in it, and James' room was down the hall. The whole house was open concept, so the hall from Angela's room to James' room did not have walls, but rather was bordered by 2 railings over which you could see down into the main floor, the open concept living and dining rooms. James is 4 years younger than us, and when he was 10, he was such a typical little boy or little brother. It's almost cartoonish to look back on. Like, I'm talking constantly bothering us, putting a stink bomb on a remote control car that he would sneak into our rooms, trying to read Angela's diary when we weren't in her bedroom, just all the stuff. But never anything cruel or out of the ordinary or sinister, just a massive handful. The basement of James and Angela's cottage was filled with storage and old toys, and sometimes on the rare occasion that we'd willingly play with James, we'd all go down to the basement and try to freak each other out. Anyway, one of the toys in the basement was your typical Raggedy Ann doll from the 60s or something. I think it belonged to my uncle when he was a kid, and then Angela when she was a baby. Her name was Trilly. I forget who named it. Anyway, I have vague memories of playing with it when we were much younger and pretending it was our third cousin or our little daughter. But since then, she'd sat in storage in the basement. But what great nightmare material, right? A creepy, limp, smiling doll. So the night I stayed over, before we went skiing in the morning, James, Angela, and I were up to our playing in the basement, and I remember we tried to freak James out by pretending Trilly was alive or something like that. Whatever. Game over, we all had dinner with the parents, then watched a movie as a family and went to bed. James to his room and Angela, and me to Angela's room. Now, this is the thing. Angela and I still joke about this night, and she remembers it just like I do, which is why I sort of wrote off my hypothesis until last week. That night, in the middle of the night, I started tossing and turning. I woke up and could tell that Angela was stirring as well. One of us said to the other, "Are you awake?" And the other said, "Yes," and we realized that we both couldn't sleep or were woken up by the same thing, or were both just feeling restless. But then, at the other end of her room, Trilly was sitting in the fucking desk chair. I think it was Angela who pointed it out. We saw a shadow, thinking it was a person, freaked out, and then relaxed briefly when we saw it was just the doll. But then, we got freaked out all over again, and were like, "Why the fuck is this fucking doll in your room?" Murderously standing up and going over to it to pick it up and throw it in James' room and pound the living Christ out of him. We turn on all the lights, turn on the hall light, stomp down the hall into his room, and turn on his lights and see he's not in his bed. We then go downstairs. My aunt and uncle's room was on the main floor, Trilly still in Angela's hands, and here my aunt and James in the washroom. Turns out James had been sick for the last few hours, and my aunt had been up all night with him, as he was throwing up in the washroom. And when we saw the scene, we immediately could tell that James had nothing to do with Trilly. Like, it was just one of those really believable situations where we could tell James truly had no idea what was going on. We even felt bad for him. And to top it off, when we told him this story in the morning, it scared him so much that he didn't go into the basement for like a year. Anyway, it just seemed really sincere. So Angela and I went back up to her room, and we were like, "Are we sure we didn't bring this up here last night? Are we sure?" We must have. Anyway, while we were really freaked, we figured that it was explainable. We knew the doll obviously didn't walk itself upstairs like it was some horror movie. But because we were 14, and all for the drama, and I remember us having the better safe than sorry mindset, we called her dog upstairs Bella, a poorly behaved black poodle. We started playing tug of war with Bella, using Trilly as the toy, and eventually Bella ripped her to shreds. Anyway, funny memory, making the dog rip up the doll. We laughed and thought we were tough and cool. Then we went back to bed. The next morning, instead of all of us going skiing, it was just me, Angela, and my uncle, because James stayed home with my aunt on account of his stomach flu. But when we woke up, Angela was acting weird. Nothing too notable, just really bizarrely quiet as she moved around her room to get her clothes out of her drawers and get changed. She didn't, acknowledge me in her room. I said something like "morning" when she didn't acknowledge me, and she looked at me and then turned back to her drawers and kept getting changed. And she was looking around weirdly. I remember that too. Almost like she'd misplaced something, but a little more dazed than that. Just moving strangely. Then she went downstairs without saying anything to me at all. I thought maybe she was just super groggy, but it still felt really weird. When I went downstairs, she was standing at the island in the kitchen buttering toast that my uncle had put in for us. I distinctly remember walking up beside her and the toaster, pulling a piece of toast out of it, putting it on the plate that had been set out for me, and when I dipped the knife into the container of butter, Angela smacked my hand away, hard, and looked at me and snapped, "What are you doing? Don't take things that aren't yours." I was shocked. It honestly felt like being struck in the face. She'd never spoken to me like that before, and even though we were like siblings, I still felt that kind of mortifying embarrassment you feel when someone calls you out on misbehaving, even though I wasn't doing anything wrong. But it was her family's butter and bread? I don't know. That's what I remember thinking. But it was awkward and weird, and I just said, what? And then she didn't say anything, just kept buttering her toast, and I mumbled some apology. The three of us then drove to the ski hill, and I kid you not, Angela and I didn't speak the whole way there. I had no idea what was up, but I didn't want to ask with her dad in the car. Then when we got to the ski hill, we went skiing just the two of us, and on the chairlift during the first run, I mustered up the courage to say, "Hey, did I do something wrong? I feel like you're really mad at me or something." And she turned to look at me and was confused. Not friendly, not warm, not reassuring, but confused. It was almost as if I was a stranger, and she looked at me as if to say, "Sorry, who are you? Why are you talking to me?" And she responded in a formal way, "Sorry, I have no idea what you're talking about." The distance in her voice was really eerie, and I started to think maybe this had to do with the doll incident the night before, and either she was trying to extend the prank, and she was the one who had put the doll on the chair, or she felt guilty that we ruined this family doll, and she resented me for being a part of it. Anyway, When we got to the top of the hill, she skied down quickly and didn't wait for me to go back up again, and we ended up skiing separately. I felt awkward and embarrassed like I'd done something wrong. I ended up skiing with my uncle, who asked me what was up with us, and I just said I didn't know. Then after our day of skiing, he dropped me off at my family's cottage and continued on home with Angela. For the rest of that whole school year, we were in ninth grade. Angela and I didn't really speak. It was really sad. We were like sisters before, but better because we weren't actually sisters, but cousins, and so we were like best friends that were related. Seriously, we were really close. And it really messed me up. I felt like she just ghosted me. I would text her and call her house, but she was always fine or with Jessica, her best friend. I chalked it up to her just outgrowing me, and it really fucking sucked. But to be honest, it was so jarring and such a stark shift that I was more confused than hurt. I talked to my mom about it, and she explained to me how rough it can be to be a teenage girl. But that following summer, we were up at our cottages again, and our family had a barbecue and invited over my aunt and uncle and Angela and James. I had seen Angela at family things a couple of times since, and she would just kind of ignore me and spend the whole time texting, which is what I expected this time. Sure enough, that's what happened for the first bit of the barbecue. But then when the food was ready, she came up beside me as we were dressing our hamburgers at the condiment table and said, "Oh my God, remember that night we got Bella to ruin Trilly?" And I was so shocked by her friendly tone, by her acting as though she were picking up a conversation we just were having, that I just stared at her and said, "Yeah, that was crazy." And she said, "Yeah, so funny. Anyway, how have you been?" Again, really different and formal. I almost couldn't get past how altered her tone was, like we'd never even met. In fact, she seemed so sprightly and kind that I thought she was mocking me. And our relationship since that barbecue carried on just like that. She started talking to me more, but I'd reference inside jokes or ways we used to be or things we used to do, and she never really latched on to any of them. I was caught between thinking she'd outgrown me and thinking she was like embarrassed of our closeness before or something and was trying to move on. I talked to my mom about this and again got the speech about how teenage girls can be really cruel or strange sometimes. So until we were about 22, we were like that. Nice to each other, talking sometimes, not that close, and I learned to not try and act like we were all close or that we had been close. I talked to my friends about it too, and they said it was normal for friendships to change like that. But something felt off about this. I started to honestly feel crazy for hanging on to this, before, memory of Angela so much. Then when we were 22, we grew apart. This time, it was mutual and natural. I moved cities, and she got engaged and became a real estate agent, and we just had nothing to talk about. It was gradual, and I didn't notice it much. Which brings us to 8 years later, just last week. I was traveling in Iceland. I had to be there very randomly for a conference or workshop I was leading for work, and turned it into a vacation. Rented a car, decided I was going to drive across the island after the conference was over and stay on the east part and explore a bit. Day 4 of my 7-day-long road trip. It's mid-afternoon. I'm hungry. I've been driving for 3 hours and have come across no sign of civilization at all, and it was 50 miles to the next town. But then, voila, a little gas station or general store or cafe. Perfect. Aw, fuck. I literally can't believe I'm writing this. It makes me sound fucking crazy. But here I go. I park in the little 3-car parking lot. I get out of my car, step onto the gravel. The sky is white, expansive. There are mountains everywhere around me, fields, sheep. The air is fresh. Seriously, middle of nowhere. I walk up the wooden rickety steps and push open the door and hear the door chimes go. A man walks out from the back room and greets me, and the place is cute. There's a little handwritten menu above the cash register, and I asked him in my pathetic Icelandic or English mix if I could have the gravlax toast. He's very friendly and kind and says yes, asks if I want a coffee. I say yes, please, blah blah. He rings me up at the cash register, and I go and sit at the one table they have and wait for my food. I look around. It's mostly a fishing supplies store with some general groceries. The man opens the door to the room from which he came, the kitchen I suppose, and says the order to the lady in the back who looks like she's doing some prep cooking. Immediately, I stop. It's freaking Angela. Or I thought it was. Now, remember, I hadn't seen Angela in about 8 years. Since her dad passed away when we were 23, and because I'd moved cities, we just had no reason to really see each other, especially after growing so far apart. So, oh my God, it's Angela. She's working at a random little general store in middle of nowhere Iceland. But wait, I thought, no, this is obviously not fucking Angela. Angela is a real estate agent in my hometown. I'd obviously know if she lived in Iceland, lol. Right? I don't really use social media, but the odd time I do, she'll pop up here and there. But I guess not enough for me to confirm she still lived in my hometown. But anyway, she looked enough like Angela that I went right up to the cash register and rang the little bell, and the guy came back out, and when he opened the door, I was able to get another look at her, and my heart skidded. A chill spread across my crown. It was 100% Angela. Like my full-on cousin. So, looking over the guy's shoulder, right at Angela, I smile and say, Angela. Oh my God. And before she could respond, the door shut again. And the guy at the cash smiled really big, a nice, friendly smile, and he looked surprised as well, and pointed back over his shoulder, and then at me, as if to say, you to know each other. Which confirmed for me that her name was Angela, because he seemed really delighted at the coincidence. Expecting her to emerge from the kitchen, I walked around to behind the cash register. The invitation was implied by the guy, and he put his arm back to open the door for me, or for Angela, whom we both expected to be making her way over to me too. When he opened the door, she was head down again, chopping vegetables. I walked through the door and said, Angela? Angela. Smiling, thinking she hadn't seen me yet or realized who I was, all context considered. She looked up at me, and then quickly, as though avoiding my eyes, looked down. Hey, she said quietly, at the cutting board. What the fuck was going on? Before I could ask anything, she said, I'm really sorry, okay? What? She repeated herself and then continued, I'm really sorry, okay? But we can't talk. I actually, had no clue what was happening. I was looking into the eyes of my cousin, whom I hadn't seen in forever, in some random fucking shack in Iceland, and she was acting skittish and afraid. I opened my mouth to protest, and she said, I need you to leave. Then she called the guy's name and said something to him in Icelandic. She can speak Icelandic. The guy came in, his demeanor totally different, almost like he was a bouncer. He gestured to my coffee and toast that were ready to go, took them in his hands, and ushered me out of the kitchen, and I could tell I no longer was welcome. Either I wasn't welcome, or I was in danger, or both. It felt more like the former. And I don't think the guy had any idea what was going on either. I think she must have said something to him like, I don't know this person is crazy, or something. That's how he was acting toward me. I got in my car. I drove 5 minutes down the road and pulled over. I miraculously had service, and I called my mom and told her everything. She kind of just laughed at me and was like, "Many patient to 894, that obviously wasn't Angela," and joked about me making some poor Icelandic woman feel extremely weird. But based off the guy's reaction when I said her name was Angela, and the way she spoke to me and said sorry and said we couldn't talk, like she knew me too. I told my mom all of this, and I sounded fucking crazy, and she just was basically like, haha, yeah, weird. I think she thinks I was making up the part about the apology. I told all of my friends this when I was still in Iceland, and they all reacted like my mom did. At this point, I had 4 days left in the country, and I kept wanting to return to the cafe or general store. But I didn't. I started to think maybe the woman thought I was someone else. But then I kept coming back to, but wait, this person was Angela. Her name, her body, her face, like I just didn't know what to do. This brings me to 2 days ago, the day before yesterday, when I returned to Canada, where I live. It's 8 o'clock in the morning, and I'm on my way to work. In my car. Just picked up a coffee. Exhausted. Not thinking about Angela at all. Thinking about my laundry, my bills, what I'm going to make for dinner. The traffic is bad, and it's a miserable day outside. My phone dings. It's a random number. The text reads, "Hey, it's Angela. How was your trip? Haven't heard from her in 8 years, except for our run-in in Iceland, if indeed it was one. No, how have you been? No, I miss you. No, long time no talk or see." I also hadn't posted anything about my trip on social media. Unless you were a friend of mine, you didn't know I was there. I immediately call my mom, who follows Angela on Instagram, and ask her to look at her profile. Sure enough, Angela, not at all to my mother's surprise, is posting stories of the bachelorette party she's at in Miami. She's like, not at all in Iceland. I have no idea what's going on. And the way Angela or the woman spoke to me in the cafe had the cadence and softness that Angela had, and in my memory, lost, starting the morning of the skiing after the incident with Trilly and the dog. For some reason, I'm fully back there in my memory now, realizing that that was the first morning of the new Angela, the one that seemed to have no emotional memory of me at all. Like, the Iceland Angela seemed more like the before Angela. I haven't replied to the text. I have no idea if it was bachelorette party, Miami Angela, or Iceland Angela that sent me the message. The area code is from neither Angela's hometown or Iceland. I need advice. I have no idea what to do or who to talk to. Do I reply to the text? What do I say? I feel like the real Angela is fucking trapped in Iceland or something, and has been for a long time. Or I don't even know. I have no idea what to do. Story 2. I work at a toll booth on a lonely country road. Please stay away. I'm sure the first thing you think of when you hear toll booth is the great inconvenience of your trip being interrupted to be charged a few bucks just to pass through. The mental image most of you might conjure is a clogged-up freeway with lines of cars packed together, waiting to pay and move on. I can imagine the people who work at those booths find it even more boring than you do. The one I work at couldn't be further from the stereotype. The toll booth I operate is situated on a small country road that curves a few times along its path through the woods surrounding it, far away from any bustling highway. The booth itself is more like a little wooden shack with chipped paint and an old sign that reads 25, an amount I don't believe has changed since sometime in the 50s. I guess that's when they decided to stop pretending it was a normal toll booth. Its only accessory is the barrier arm I can flip up or down. The interior is simple, with a single chair and a light on the ceiling, the only light besides the moon for miles. It only has one operator on any given night. Most nights, that's me. On the surface, it doesn't make sense why our local government would pay someone to sit out in the middle of nowhere to operate a booth that makes no money. And believe me, they pay well. But if you spent a single night out there, you would understand why. No, there isn't a sudden influx of 1,000 cars waiting to pay their tolls at AM. What we protect by keeping this booth running is worth far more than any monetary cost could make up for. In my town, the job of operating the lonely booth is one that is highly respected and rarely spoken of. In fact, it's something of an unspoken rule that you keep private any conversations about the booth, the road, or anything related. Everyone around here knows there's something off about this place. Almost everyone has seen something they can't explain or something they wish they hadn't. A lot of rural towns have their own urban legends. Most of the time, their residents embrace the myths. I suspect it's because they all know it's a myth, save for a few crazies. Our town is the opposite. We keep quiet about the things we've seen. The most we can do around here is to steer people clear of the road and hope nothing strays from it. The last we wanted was for the rest of the world to find out, and I suspect we're not the only ones. You see, our town is doing far better than most in our area. Our infrastructure never seems to crumble or degrade. Our public schools are well funded, and no one is ever stuck looking for work. The reason this is noteworthy is that our town isn't exactly in the most prosperous region of America. This money is coming from somewhere, and it's not from our little property taxes. I've got a suspicion that the feds or someone else is dumping money into our town, and that they're keeping tabs on our little toll booth situation as well. I know this all sounds ridiculous now, but once you get a better idea of my job and of recent events, I think you'll understand. As I said, the booth only has one operator each night, a tradition that goes as far back as we've been a town. Each week, we hold a private meeting at our town hall. At this meeting are all current toll booth attendants and any former ones who can make it. Most of the time, the meetings don't last longer than 15 minutes, but after the emergency meeting I called a few weeks ago, we've held them every day, and they've been taking a lot longer. The reason for which you will know soon enough. I suppose this is a good time to explain what happens at the toll booth and the road it sits on. You'll need to know my rules. Rule 1. The booth does not need to be attended during the day. Not much happens at the booth when the sun is up, but the attendant for the night, which is usually me, must be at the booth an hour before sunset and stay an hour after sunrise. The attendant for the night is not to leave the booth at any time during their shift, for any reason. Transportation isn't an issue because either the sheriff or one of the deputies always gives us a ride to the booth at night and a ride back to town in the morning. Rule 2. No cell phone, radio, or other electronic or communication device is allowed while operating the booth at night. The only thing running on electricity that a booth attendant is allowed to have is a flashlight. If you happen to bring a device accidentally, shut it off, store it inside the booth, and pray that it doesn't turn itself back on. Leaving it outside the booth is not an option. Should your device turn itself on inside of the booth, your next best bet is to destroy it. This sounds like a drastic measure, but I've made this mistake before. I lasted about an hour before I couldn't take the screams coming from my phone and stomped it into oblivion. Haven't made the mistake of taking it with me again. I've never been told what the screams and other noises are, but I do know that past attendants have heard the same thing. Rule 3. Rare as they are, cars may approach the gate at any time during the night. A common trait among those who end up on this road at night is confusion. The attendant's job is to decide whether they will be let through or turned away. The driver, along with confusion, may express other emotions. They may be distressed, angry, paranoid, or fearful. Try to calm them down and put their minds at ease as best you can. Once you believe they are ready, you'll simply ask them to pay their toll. One of two outcomes will occur. If the driver has no notable reaction, questions you, or hands you a regular quarter, you must leave the barrier arm down and turn them away. Do whatever is necessary to try and make them leave. If they threaten you or attempt to drive through anyway, you can let them know you'll be calling the police, even though you have no means of calling them. This scenario is unlikely because no modern navigation system would bring them down this road. All of the locals know not to use it, and it would be unusual for an outsider to learn about it. Though we have, on occasion, had to deal with a few lost travelers, most of the time they are compliant. Get them off the road as soon as possible and direct them towards town, where they can get their footing. Above all else, they cannot pass through the gate. However, if you ask them to pay their toll, another outcome is possible, and unfortunately, the most common. They'll come to a sudden realization, as evidenced by their facial expression. It's as if they remember something, slowly reaching into their pocket and pulling out a black coin. They know they'll have to give it to you to pass. Some accept their fate graciously, others cry, but they all follow the road once the barrier arm is lifted. Around the corner they drive, never to be seen again. In my first months working here, I was confused as to who these people were. I wondered what it was they knew, how they got these coins in the first place, or what the coins were. All I knew was to leave it in the booth to be picked up by the next shift. This was until I happened to be watching the local news one morning after I got home. They talked about a man who was killed in a car accident the night before and showed a picture of his face. A face I had seen only hours before, puzzled and afraid as he asked me where he was and what was going on. When I asked him for his toll, he froze, slowly reached into his coat pocket with a quivering hand, and pulled out a black coin before placing it in mine. He gripped the steering wheel and faced forward, knowing he had to pass through and drive around the corner. He knew where he was going. Sitting in my living room that morning, recounting the events of the last hours, I realized that I was the last person to see that man. He was already dead, just passing through, as were the dozens I had seen before, and the countless more I knew I would see. It was the moment I realized the road was some kind of path to somewhere beyond. As for this rule, I don't believe anyone has ever stopped the dead from passing when their time has come. I don't think anyone ever could. It's something so surreal that in the moment, all you can do is let autopilot take over and continue with your duties as you were told. But as for letting the living through, I'm afraid it has been done before. A few decades back, a visitor from out of town was passing through town. Back then, he didn't have a phone to give him directions, so he had to go off a map. Even with a map, I'm certain he didn't know of the road, because it was never put on any map. My best guess is that he happened to see it and figured it could be some sort of a shortcut. When he approached the gate, he was, of course, turned away by the toll booth attendant, but he wasn't taking no for an answer. The man got violent with the attendant, pushing him over and raising the arm himself before driving through. This hadn't happened before, at least as far as any of the past attendants of the booth who were still alive could recollect. No one was sure what would happen next. Back then, they only knew the rules, not the consequences, but they didn't have to wait long to find out. The next night, the same man in the same car rolled up to the booth. When asked for his toll, this time he presented a black coin. He seemed to have lost his memory of the night before, only knowing that he needed to pass through, but not why. This has continued every night for the last several decades. Each night, he pulls up, confused as to why he's here and needs to pass, and forgetting each time. Each night, he gives us a coin. Each time he passes on, driving around the bend into the woods, not seen until the next night. He never ages and his appearance never changes. Sometimes he even says the same exact thing as the night before. Other times, he expresses a sense that he's been here before and that everything feels familiar, like he almost remembers sometimes. His fate is one I wouldn't wish upon my worst enemies. Dead, but not being allowed to move on, and never remembering why you're there, living the same moment night after night, until who knows when. His story is one that reminds me of the importance of our job here, but not the only one. Rule 4. At some random point in the night, you may hear something moving through the trees, something big. Sometimes they emerge from the woods, other times they'll be coming down the road. Try not to be afraid. No harm is coming your way, quite the opposite. However, I can see how this would be hard to believe. In any case, you need to raise the arm and let them through. I remember the first time I saw them. I could hear a clop somewhere down the road, coming towards the booth like a horse galloping. I rose to my feet and grabbed my flashlight, intrigued. I remember hoping it wasn't someone's horse. I had never been told what to do in that scenario. When I did point my flashlight at the road, I nearly had a heart attack at the sight before me. A bull moose was approaching with a brisk walk. Of course, I was warned of this, but the details I was given were vague. All I was told was that a moose might approach the gate, and I was supposed to let it through. I wasn't told that this thing stands at around 9 or 10 feet at the shoulder, or that its fur is so dark I couldn't see it without my flashlight, save for the massive antlers, which are white as snow in contrast. The only other part of its body clearly visible from afar were its eyes, which shone with a small speck of white light, glowing in the darkness. I screamed and retreated to my booth, tempted to run off into the night and abandon my post. Fortunately, the moose slowed its pace and eventually stopped in front of the barrier arm. This calmed me down, and I slowly raised it, watching as the moose approached to pass. As it did, I noticed the halter and reins on its head. I followed them up, only to meet another set of eyes, identical to the moose's, towering over me. Again, I yelled but contained my volume when I realized whoever or whatever this was on top of the moose was making eye contact with me as they passed. This figure was dark, if not darker than the moose it rode on. Something akin to a shadow. Just like everyone in their cars, they walked down the road, beyond the bend and out of sight. I had to sit down for half an hour before I stopped shaking. Needless to say, I wasn't very happy those finer details had been left out. Only after my shift and expressing my frustration was I told more. Apparently, this hunter and his moose have been around a long time. So long that no attendant alive today can remember a time without them. Some believe they've been here for the past couple 100 years or more, possibly as long as the strange road and the booth have been around. What we do know is that they aren't bound to the road like the others. At our town hall, we possess a written account of the hunter and his mount riding right through town in the middle of the night back in 1919. To this day, a few residents have seen the moose while they're driving at night. You may be wondering why I refer to the figure on the moose's back as the hunter. Well, that's what us attendants call him. Every so often, he and his moose will arrive at the booth, dragging a corpse behind them. When I say corpse, I don't mean an animal, or even a human for that matter. I mean abominations out of your wildest nightmares. Things that send a shiver down your spine and make you want to vomit at the same time. Things you would expect to find talked about in a religious text when the end of days comes. The hunter drags these things down the road and around the curve. I can't be certain of anything, But if you ask me, he's taking them back to some sort of afterlife or underworld. Maybe it's the same place the dead go when they drive around the curve. Or maybe somewhere in the road is a pathway to many different places. I couldn't tell you. What I believe, like the other attendants and anyone who knows about the hunter and his moose, is that they're here to protect us. Whatever these things are that he's taking with him aren't supposed to be here in the first place, and he's just here to set things right. Now, this is where we get to the point, why I'm telling you about all of this. I explained before that the people from my town like to keep these things quiet, and for the most part, I agree. I'm not a fan of airing our business to the outside world. It's attention we don't need. Unfortunately, I don't think we have a choice this time. It began a couple of weeks ago, during one of my shifts at the booth. Everything was going well for the most part. No new dead passed through that night, nor did any living try. The only customer I had was our regular poor old bastard, confused as ever. After him, all was quiet for a few hours until I heard a slow clop coming down the road yet again. These days, I'm not afraid anymore. I've seen the hunter and his moose enough times that I don't fear either of them, and like I said, I've come to respect them for the things they take out of this world. The one thing I often fear is the sight of whatever it is they're dragging out. That night was no exception. They approached the gate and stopped in front of it. Before I moved to raise the barrier arm, I shone my flashlight at the rope being dragged behind, and the dreadful thing attached. The end of the rope was tied in a knot around an enormous pair of cloven hooves. Hooves that belonged to what looked like the lower half of some sort of deer. As I moved up the body with my flashlight, I quickly discovered that this wasn't just some massive buck. The legs may have been reminiscent of one, but the upper body was that of a man. A man in a striped red and blue clown suit. The sleeves were shredded at the wrist, and protruding from them were long, blackened hands with claws for fingers. The head was by far the most grotesque part. Its nose and mouth, like the rest of its head, were covered in the skin like that of a pale man, but their shape was that of a deer's. Blood dripped out of its half-open mouth. The ears were similar, with the same pale color and texture as a man's, but shaped like a deer's. It was like someone took human ears and stretched them out, morphing them to fit the disgusting shape they desired. On top sat a red and blue jester hat, and a set of antlers sprouting out above them. I froze for a moment upon seeing the entirety of this beast, but snapped out of it when I reminded myself that I had a job to do, and that I better do it if I didn't want to see this thing any longer. I walked over to the barrier arm and raised it. The moose resumed its trot forward along the road and past the gate. As they passed me, I couldn't help but watch the deer clown monster it was dragging behind. A streak of blood followed on the road behind it. Right before it passed by the booth completely, I lit up its face with my flashlight to get a final look. Its eyelids shot open, revealing the black and brown eyes underneath. Then it opened its mouth and let out a loud, pain-filled bleat before it leaned down and clawed at the knot holding its hooves. In only a few seconds, the ropes were cut and the beast attempted to stand. It didn't get far in its initial attempt, however, because the bull moose in front of it struck its head with a powerful kick. Another splash of blood came from the clown's mouth along with one of its teeth as it fell back to the ground, seemingly knocked out for a moment. While it recovered, the hunter turned his moose around to face it head-on. I ran from the booth and hid behind a tree to the side of the road, but kept an eye on the fight. Air shot from the moose's nostrils as it began to grunt. His grunts were louder and deeper than the bleats of the deer clown. I could feel my chest vibrate with each powerful grunt. The clown finally stood and stared back at the hunter and moose, letting a few more bleats out, as if to challenge them. At its standing height, this thing was taller than the moose, though it was obvious the moose was much larger and heavier overall. The moose lowered its head and charged. Before it connected, the clown thing attempted to claw at the hunter on its back but failed. It was picked up off the ground by the moose's antlers and driven through a row of trees that came crashing down on top of it. The moose backed up a step and turned, allowing the hunter to throw a new rope around the clown's head. The moose charged away with the hunter holding the new rope. They began to drag the clown by the neck, I assume hoping to finally make it around the bend this time. Unfortunately, it was still conscious and sliced the rope with its claws again. The clown didn't waste any time, hurrying to its hooves and charging into the woods. The hunter on his moose followed. In only a moment, they were both out of sight. I only noticed my heavy breathing after all was quiet again. It took me an hour to work up the courage to leave the tree line and return to my booth. When I did, I noticed the tooth from the clown lying on the road and collected it. Fortunately for me, the rest of my shift was uneventful. Unfortunately, the hunter never returned with the clown. When the sheriff picked me up at sunrise, I told him to hurry to the town hall for an emergency meeting. During the drive, I contacted everyone else and told them to get there as soon as possible. At the meeting, I presented the tooth and gave an account of what I had just witnessed. There was a mix of emotions. None of the other attendants had ever seen something escape from the hunter before, and none knew what it meant. The agreed-upon action was to wait at least a week. It's unusual to not see the hunter and his moose for more than a week, so we figured he would catch the clown in the next couple of days, and all would be sorted. I dearly wish that was what happened. A day later, a video surfaced on the internet from the town over. It showed a pair of deer antlers sticking out above the tops of trees as the man recording was driving. A few days after that, another video. This one was recorded by a woman who awoke in the middle of the night to laughter outside. Halfway through the video, you can see the antlers and part of the hat outside of a second-story window. The woman recording didn't notice, but commenters on the video sure did. Last week, someone halfway across the state uploaded a grainy photo of a black moose on a hill in a clearing between the trees, far off in the distance. These are just the ones I've seen. Now you can see why we've been having meetings every week. I can tell we're not the only ones in a panic either. Strangers started showing up around town, and not the kind that are just passing through. They try their best to fit in, but they stick out like a sore thumb. The dead giveaway is when they show up to our bars and diners, striking up a conversation before asking folk what they've seen around here lately, asking about the booth and the strange road. In the last week or so, they've stopped trying so hard to hide it. Black government SUVs have been crowding the parking spaces downtown. We kept the tooth in the town hall along with every other document and record we have about the booth, and now it's all missing. It's clear that whatever happened that night wasn't supposed to, and we weren't the only ones who noticed. I didn't work last night, but the attendant who did had a lot to report this morning in our meeting. The feds drove out to the booth and took a look around. He pleaded with them not to drive through, but in response, they told him they already knew why they shouldn't. Something we weren't expecting. It's only a matter of time before they come for me. I suppose I'll tell them the truth when the time comes. As much as we like to keep it a secret in our town, the genie is out of the bottle. I figured I would at least tell all of you before the feds. Every one of you should know what's out there. As for me, I'll keep watching the booth at night. Sticking to my duties is about all I can do. Still, I'll be keeping up with all of the developments that I can. I can only guess based on the posts I've strung together, but it looks like the clown is still on the move, and our hunter close behind. I can only pray that he catches it soon. In the meantime, if you hear strange laughter in your backyard at night, stay inside. Story 3. I was camping with my friends. Some of us remember what happened that night differently. The fire crackled softly as we sat in a circle, the darkness of the forest pressing in around us. I glanced at my friends, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. It was our annual camping trip, a tradition we had kept since high school. This year, we had chosen a remote spot deep in the woods, far from the nearest town. Everything had been going smoothly until that night. Do you guys remember what happened? Sarah asked, her voice tinged with unease. I frowned, trying to piece together the fragmented memories. I remembered the fire, the laughter, and the drinking. But after that, things got hazy. We were telling ghost stories, right? I said, hoping someone could fill in the blanks. Yeah, Mark replied, but he didn't sound sure. We were, but then, I don't know. It's like I blacked out or something. Tom, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up. I remember, he said, his voice low. There was something in the woods. My heart skipped a beat, a cold wave of dread washing over me. Flashes of the night surged back into my mind, shadowy figures slipping between the ancient trees, their movements fluid and unnatural. The wind carried faint, haunting whispers that seemed to come from all directions, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. An overwhelming sense of dread had settled over me like a suffocating shroud, making it hard to breathe. Each memory felt surreal, like fragments of a terrible dream that couldn't possibly be real, yet the fear they evoked was all too tangible. What did we see? I asked, my mouth dry. Tom's eyes darted to the dark woods surrounding us. I know the feeling it gave me. Sarah shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. I thought it was just a nightmare we all had, in unison? I don't think so, Tom insisted, his voice trembling. A silence fell over us, the only sound the crackling fire and the distant rustling of leaves. The fear in our eyes was unmistakable, but there was something else, confusion, like our memories were fragmented pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. Wait, Mark said suddenly. Didn't we run? I remember running through the woods, trying to get away. I remember that too, I said, the memory surfacing. Branches whipped against my face, the ground uneven beneath my feet, the sensation of being chased. But we didn't all run, Sarah said, her voice trembling. Some of us stayed behind. A cold chill ran down my spine. What do you mean? Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I saw you, Jack. You were standing by the fire, talking to it. Like you were in a trance. That's not possible, I said, shaking my head. I was with you guys. We all ran together. Tom's face went pale. No, she's right. I remember that too. You were saying something to it. Panic surged through me. But that's not what happened. I insisted. I was with you guys. Then how do we all remember it differently? Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We sat in stunned silence, the fire casting eerie shadows around us. I could feel the weight of the conflicting memories pressing down on me, each one as real as the other but impossible to reconcile. Suddenly, a twig snapped in the darkness. We all froze, our eyes darting to the edge of the firelight. A figure stood just beyond the reach of the flames, tall and unnaturally thin. The details were obscured by the shadows, but there was something familiar about its posture, its presence. It's back, Tom whispered, his voice trembling. Who's back? Sarah responded. I don't know, I replied, my voice barely a whisper. Sarah clutched my arm. We need to leave. Now. Before we could react, the figure emerged from the shadows and stepped into the flickering light of the fire, revealing a face that sent a chill down my spine. It was me, or at least It looked like me, but there was something off, something inherently wrong about the way it moved and the expression etched on its features. Its eyes, once mirrors of my own, now glinted with an unsettling darkness, devoid of any trace of humanity. They locked onto mine with a predatory intensity, and a sickening smile spread across its lips, a twisted, malevolent grin that sent a shiver down my spine. The resemblance was uncanny, yet there was an undeniable aura of menace emanating from this doppelganger, as if it were a distorted reflection of my worst fears and darkest desires come to life. "Some of us remember," it said, its voice a chilling echo of my own. "Some of us don't," my friends screamed, the sound piercing the night, but I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The creature lunged forward, and the world went black. When I opened my eyes, I was back by the fire. My friends were gone, the forest eerily silent. The memories of what happened, of what was real, swirled in my mind, indistinguishable from each other. I was alone, but I could feel eyes watching me from the darkness. As I stood up, disoriented, I saw movement at the edge of the clearing. My friends emerged from the shadows, looking as confused and terrified as I felt. "What happened?" Mark asked, his voice shaky. We quickly gathered our things, the sense of urgency palpable. As we packed up, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching us, waiting. We navigated through the dense woods, the path a barely discernible ribbon in the dim light of dawn. The forest seemed alive, closing in around us with an oppressive, almost sentient presence. Tall, gnarled trees whispered secrets we couldn't understand, their leaves rustling with a language of their own. Every snap of a twig underfoot, every rustle of leaves overhead, sent jolts of panic through us, our nerves frayed and on edge. The sky slowly lightened, casting a ghostly pallor over the landscape, and our hearts leaped with relief as we finally glimpsed the edge of the woods. The sight of our cars, silent and waiting like sentinels, brought a rush of hope. We didn't waste a moment, throwing our gear into the trunks with frantic, fumbling hands, our only thought to put as much distance between us and that cursed campsite as possible. The forest's grip seemed to loosen as we sped away, but the unease clung to us, a shadow of the night we couldn't escape. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I saw the tall figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching us with an unnerving stillness. Then it was gone, swallowed by the shadows. We didn't speak much on the drive back. The silence was heavy, each of us lost in our thoughts. When we finally parted ways, promising to keep in touch, I knew things would never be the same. That night, as I lay in bed, the events of the past 2 days replayed in my mind. Just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard a faint knock at my window. My heart pounded as I turned to look, and there, standing outside, was the doppelganger, its expression blank, its eyes empty. It smiled, a twisted reflection of my own face, and mouthed the words, "Some of us remember. What did I stumble upon? What does it want from me?" Story 4. I got trapped on an Alpine coaster for hours. You guys know what an Alpine coaster is. They are like a small roller coaster you find in the mountains. They are also called summer toboggans or mountain coasters, and I think there's some long German compound word they are called in parts of Europe. They are like a roller coaster, but with much smaller 1 or 2-person sleds you just sit on instead of multi-person cars you ride in, and instead of being built with, like a scaffolding or a framework, the tracks are just on the ground, using the elevation of the mountain. Basically, it's a coaster track on the side of a mountain where you ride a sled down. They are pretty fun. Or at least I used to think so. They are more personal. than roller coasters, and although you get nowhere near the speed on them that you do on a good traditional roller coaster, and they can't do corkscrews or loops or anything like that, the openness and simplicity of the ride gives an impression of a much greater speed. You're just sitting there with nothing but a little plastic sled and the track between you and the ground as it goes zooming by. It's like the difference between how fast a go-kart feels compared to how fast a sports car feels. You know the sports car goes faster, but the open simpleness of a go-kart feels a different kind of fast. There's plenty of POV YouTube videos if you want to get the basic idea of what they are. I used to love Alpine coasters. Used to. My family used to go to Gatlinburg and Pigeon Forge and up and down the Smoky Mountains for vacations when I was a kid, and they are common in that area, and I'd always rode them every chance I got. But as with so many things after I grew up and went to college, they just became part of my childhood that slipped away. They aren't exactly common once you get away from the mountains. Until one cool spring afternoon in 2004. I was in my final year at college, and I was driving back to campus in Tennessee after a short visit to my folks in North Carolina. It was only like a 4 or 5 hour drive via the most efficient route, and I had no need to be back at campus early, so instead of taking the freeway all the way, I got off and took part of my trip through the mountains. The scenery was nicer, and I admit I liked pushing my Camaro just a little faster than I should through the twisty mountain roads. Just after lunchtime, happened upon one of those little by-the-highway tourist towns deep somewhere in the Smoky Mountains near the Carolina or Tennessee border. Nothing fancy, a gas station or truck stop, a diner, a couple of places selling tourist merch nestled deep in the mountains. I pulled into the gas station. My tank was getting low, and I needed to stretch my legs, maybe grab something to eat. It was still early, and I only had another couple of hours. I could kill an hour or so and still make it back to campus at a decent hour. I pulled into the gas station and was filling my tank when I happened to glance across the road, and, well, I'll be damned. There it was. The Blue Ridge Alpine Coaster, nestled on the side of the mountain, was a building, a mock-up of a red barn, where a single-railed track that led up into the mountains, where it soon got lost in the greenery. Wooden hand-painted standees of cartoon character bears dressed in stereotypical hillbilly get-up stood around, some of them holding signs showing the ride hours and ticket costs and other info. I had to admit, as silly as it was, it made me smile. I finished pumping my gas, and well, nostalgia is a helluva thing. I decided then and there I could waste a little time riding an Alpine coaster again after all these years before getting back on the road. I parked my car in a corner of the truck stop's parking lot, put my phone in the center console. This being the days before smartphones, when people didn't keep their phones with them 24/7, and I didn't want my old Nokia brick phone to fall out during the ride, locked my car and walked across the mountain highway to the Alpine Coaster building. Getting closer, the place was less inviting. The half-hearted attempt at a whimsical Fox Americana kitsch was far less effective when it brushed up against the actual decaying, run-down wooden building. Hell, calling it a building was generous. It was a wood frame holding up a long roof that covered the area where you got on the sleds. The wood boards creaked under my footsteps. The only real enclosed structure was a shack that held what I assumed was a ticket booth. A door on the side had both a single-occupancy bathroom with an out-of-order sign on it. An old Pepsi machine buzzed and glowed next to it. Still, the place looked alive. Ahead of me, a bored-looking attendant was helping a mother and her young son into one of the sleds while in a bored monotone repeating the safety brief. A few people were waiting in line at the ticket booth. Up in the mountains, the playful shouts of people on the ride echoed down. Fond memories of my own childhood rides flooded my mind, 10 minutes and $15 later, I was settling into the hard plastic seat of a bright red sled sat atop a simple aluminum rail. I couldn't help but grin as the sled slowly climbed the track up the mountains, making click-clack ratcheting sounds that hit my nostalgia centers hard. I felt good. The air was cool and crisp and smelled of pine. Higher and higher in the mountains we went. I don't know if this is my mind trying to make sense of it after the fact, but when I remember these moments, the last good moments, I sometimes think I remember a very slight, very subtle pit of fear in my stomach. I honestly don't know if I felt it at the time or not, or it's just how my mind tries to make sense of it looking back at. But either way, mostly, I was enjoying myself. I smiled. I was a kid again. I could hear riders in front of me let out that initial yell of terrified glee you get at the first drop of any good ride. It peaked. I glanced around. I could see for miles, rolling hills and mountains. The sled tipped over and zoomed down the mountain, and I let out the same happy yell I heard from the other passengers. The ride zoomed down the mountain, catching speed. The mountain forest floor zoomed past, only a few feet under me. Trees zoomed past. I gave out a happy whoop as the ride banked hard around a curve, and then looped back under itself, another dip, another curve. I closed my eyes, enjoying the feel of the G-forces pulling me every which way. There was no one exact single moment where things started to go wrong. The ride kept going and going. At this point, the first creeping thought entered my head. The ride was still going. It just started to hit me. This ride was going on for a really long time. I had taken a dozen rides on various coasters of this type before that day, and they topped out at about 5 minutes or so, and that was the long ones. Longer than a traditional roller coaster, but not that long. This one had been going on for what felt like 10, maybe even 15 minutes. I looked back over my shoulder and could only see trees, moving too fast to really get a bearing on where I was at in relation to anything. I wasn't exactly really worried yet. Okay, so I had found a particularly long Alpine coaster. At the time, I wasn't 100% sure they didn't exist or anything like that. I was a little unnerved, but nothing was happening that was impossible. Yet, I was trying to talk myself back into just enjoying the ride and stop overthinking it, and halfway succeeded when out of nowhere, I suddenly banked hard, the track jutting out almost over a sheer cliffside. I gripped the sled more tightly as I was whipped around. The ride then dipped hard and picked up speed, barreling down the side of the mountain. I was pushed back against the seat by the force of the drop. Jesus, I didn't remember them being this rough. I was feeling slightly nauseous. And where had this elevation drop come from, I wondered. I was still in the foothills, and I didn't remember seeing anything but gentle rolling hills and light drops from looking at the ride's route earlier. How the ride had managed such a long, steep drop in this area, I didn't know. For the first time, I hoped that the ride would be over soon. I had no idea then how much I would want that same hope to be true, so much more as time went on. With a whiplash motion, I was whipped forward and then back as the ride leveled out on flat ground again. But by this point, I was going fast too fast. My neck hurt from the mild whiplash, and I felt sour in my throat, and for a moment, the contents of my stomach threatened to come back up. For the first, but hardly the last time, the ride felt unsafe. Alpine coasters are tame affairs, much slower and gentler than full-on roller coasters, but this thing was throwing me around like no thrill ride I had ever been on. I looked around. I wasn't that deep into the woods. I should have been able to see a glimpse of something. The highway, the gas station, the tourist shops, the Alpine Coaster office, something, anything. But nothing. Just trees. I forced back some panic for the first time. I closed my eyes and counted to 10. The ride zoomed along. I counted 260. I counted 260 again. And again. Okay, this was getting uncomfortably harder and harder to explain. Suddenly, I noticed that up ahead, the track seemed to just end. For one brief, terrible moment, I thought the track just ended, but I was wrong. Almost without warning, the track dipped in an almost vertical drop. I almost screamed as I plummeted for 20, maybe 30 seconds before flattening out again. By this point, the voice in my head that was telling me something was wrong was louder, and I could no longer tell myself it was wrong. This ride could not have been this long. I tried to make sense of it, wondering if somehow I had gotten diverted onto some kind of maintenance track or, hell, for one brief irrational moment, even entertaining the idea that I had wound up on an actual train track somehow. But that was absurd. The rail below me was not a train track. It was still just the simple aluminum rail of an Alpine coaster, and there had been no diversions or junctions in the track. I was still on the ride, as insane as that was starting to feel. Had the ride somehow looped? Again, after having the thought, I immediately dismissed it as crazy. There's no way I could have missed the ride building where I got on. And what kind of ride loops over and over? The sled zoomed through the forest, oddly never seeming to lose speed, despite the relatively flat grade of the track. I cursed myself for leaving my phone in the car and not wearing a watch. I don't know exactly how long I had been on the ride at that point, but it felt like I had been on the ride for a half hour, maybe more. But time is a funny thing when you're in a situation you've never been in. Could have been more, could have been less at that point. My pride finally failed me. I started to scream for help. I screamed out that the ride was broken, to stop it, that I needed help. I did that for about 10 minutes or so, I think. The ride kept going. Mostly flat, level track with occasional mild dips and turns. But the simple length of the ride grew more and more unnerving and unexplainable. I thought about just bailing out, but the ride, impossibly, was still not slowing down, and chunks of mountain rock and thick tree trunks were all around me. Bailing out without risking smashing into a rock or a tree seemed impossible. The ride kept going. Up ahead, the forest was clearing out some. I could see the forest brightening, more sunlight making it through the canopy. I wasn't prepared for what I saw. The trees stopped, and I had just enough time to take in a flat, open area of rock, maybe 40, 50 yards at most before another sheer cliff. The tracks twisted and turned and then shot straight down. But that wasn't the worst of it. For a moment, a very short moment, I had a clear view for miles, and the landscape was, to be blunt, totally impossible. Any possibility that I had just stumbled on some incredibly long ride was blasted out of my head. Barren, volcanic-looking rock stretched 4 miles. Jagged, black rocky outcroppings as far as the eye could see. I was in the goddamn Smoky Mountains. They don't look like that. I had a few moments for the terror of that view to settle in before the cart plunged into another horrifying drop. I gripped the handles of the cheap plastic sled until my knuckles turned white. The drop felt completely vertical, like I was falling at terminal velocity. I screamed. My stomach dropped and turned. I imagined the sled coming away from the track, and me just plummeting screaming to my death on the rocks below. But somehow the ride still functioned. I closed my eyes tightly and just waited for whatever was going to happen. Eventually, after several what felt like a full minute of steep plunging, the track again leveled out, and I opened my eyes to see myself moving at breakneck speed over that black, rocky landscape. Now that I was moving on a more or less flat horizontal track again, I took a few deep breaths. I looked over the edge of the track. Nothing but that black, jagged rock, almost looking like obsidian, zooming past. I had no idea how fast the sled was moving now. Fast. Faster than a gravity-powered sled should be moving. and the track was higher off the ground now. Alpine slides usually stick pretty close to the ground, but I was 20 feet or so in the air, the track suspended in the air, a simple metal tube tower like a power pylon every few yards. Without any immediate threat, and the sled moving fast but steadily and level, I was able to think about my situation again, for all the good that did me. Ahead of me, the track just continued to the horizon, nothing but the same rocky landscape as far as I could see. I craned my neck to look back over my shoulder and looked back behind me, and it looked the same. Even the mountains were but distant specks on the horizon behind me. This was insane. There's not a giant, seemingly endless field of black jagged rock in the goddamn Smoky Mountains. There's no cliff faces tall and steep enough for a multi-minute vertical drop. And Alpine coasters were small affairs, not major engineering projects that span miles with pylons and vertical tracks. It made no sense. Sadly, it wasn't going to start making any more sense anytime soon. The ride kept going. I was on this rocky landscape for several hours. I feel comfortable saying this because I could actually notice the sun getting lower in the sky. And the sled wasn't slowing down despite the grade of the track being flat. I was getting cramped from sitting and stretched my legs and twisted my back as best I could. Didn't do much help. My eyes were starting to get irritated from the constant wind in them. Worst of all, it was starting to get chilly. I only had on a light jacket, a windbreaker, just something to keep the breeze off me, no real insulation. I was cold, my joints were stiff. I was hungry and thirsty. My eyes watered and my throat was so dry it was sore. But none of that was as bad as just how little sense this all made. There's nothing like this place anywhere near the Smoky Mountains. This was like some volcanic rock landscape. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. The ride kept going. My mind didn't even try to process this. Whatever I was experiencing simply couldn't be possible. I was crazy. I was dreaming. The CIA had kidnapped me and dosed me with some new version of LSD, and I was in a straitjacket in a padded room at Area 51. The sled kept zooming along as the sky turned to dusk. Soon, the bridge disappeared from my view, and I continued on along the endless, rocky, featureless landscape. I sat back against the sled, mentally and physically numb. I was exhausted. I was thirsty. I was cramping up. I was hungry. I had to pee. I held it for as long as I could, then had no choice but just wet myself. I cried until I had no more tears left. Then I just sat there. The ride kept going. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, my throat felt like sandpaper. I dug around in my jacket pockets, hoping to find a stick of gum or piece of candy. Nothing. I checked again, having nothing else to do. Under a crumpled store receipt in the inner pocket of my jacket was a single old, forgotten cough drop. I unwrapped it from the paper and popped it in my mouth. Saliva flooded back into my mouth, and I was overwhelmed by the methanol and medicine taste. It was something at least, although I knew it would be a brief and temporary fix at best. I felt my eyes get heavy. It was getting colder. That mountain cold. That deep cold the mountains have even into the early spring when the sun goes down. That kind that just pulls the heat right out of you. I shivered. A terrible, horrible certainty came to me. I would ride until I passed out from exhaustion or the hypothermia set in. My body would tumble off the sled to fall and skip across the rocky ground like a stone skipping across a lake, my bones breaking as I tumbled until my body finally came to a stop. If I was lucky, I would be killed and not have to lie for days, broken and bruised, on the ground until death took me. The ride kept going. The ride kept going. The fucking ride kept going. Fuck you, I said to the ride, my voice a hoarse whisper. I pulled my jacket closer around me, for all the good it did. The cold wind was slowly, but surely pulling my body heat away. My shivering got worse, crossing the line from a simple, normal shiver into those deep, almost violent, full-body ones. I wasn't anything you could call an experienced outdoorsman, but I knew enough to know that wasn't a good sign. It was getting dark. There was a full moon at least, so I wasn't totally in the dark. About then, I noticed something. The landscape, what little I could see in the fading light, was changing. It was smoothing out, becoming less rocky and craggy. Up ahead, an odd, shimmering light was starting to appear on the ground. I was over it before I even realized what it was. The tracks were going over a smooth surface. Water. It was a lake. The odd lights I had seen with the moon, reflected in ripples on the lake. Within minutes, I was out of the view of the land. After the nearly endless rocky landscape and everything else I had seen, it scared me how little I was shocked. I didn't like how mentally numb I was getting. I leaned over. There was enough moonlight to see the water, 15 or 20 feet below the track. The pylons holding up the track went into the water. The light wasn't good enough to even make a guess at how far they went down or how deep the water was. I leaned back in the sled. My eyes were red and bloodshot from the constant wind. I closed them. This was a mistake. I jerked awake. I don't know if I dozed off for a split second or an hour. My weight had shifted, and I caught myself as my center of gravity was in danger of sending me off the sled and into the water. I screamed in anger. A deep primal scream. I hurt so bad. My joints felt like they were full of glass. My limbs were full of pins and needles. I glanced over at the water. For the first time on the very edges of my brain, a tiny voice started to speak up, telling me that I could be all over if I just jumped. I shut the voice up, but it scared me still. I sat there as the ride went on. It felt like hours. Eventually, the lake ended in a rocky shoreline. The damned ride. There was no safe place to bail out. If the ride slowed down, it was high in the air. If it moved toward the ground, it sped up. Sharp rocks, big trees, nothing you could safely bail out into. I kept having to force myself awake. I kept dozing off. Once I felt myself falling asleep and drove a vicious uppercut into my own nose to stave it off. I seriously started to think about how much longer I could hang on. The voice came back again. This time I didn't shut it up. I wasn't admitting it to myself yet, but I was starting to think about the best way to land that would end it quickly if I needed to. Something was ahead. The track seemed to dip into the ground. I was too tired, too beaten to even get scared. I was just resigned to whatever happened at this point. With little warning, the track took my sled into a tunnel in the ground. Everything went completely pitch black. After several moments, even the dim moonlight was gone. This was the worst part. The creepy forest, the immense rocky landscape, the eerie lake. Those were bad. But this was just nothing. Nothing to look at, nothing to hear, nothing for reference or sense of where I was going. The walls of the tunnel felt like they were inches from me in every direction. The air felt thick, like there wasn't enough oxygen. With every moment I was in that tunnel, I lost a little more hope. After a long, long time, I made a decision. When I got out of this tunnel, I would jump. I didn't care anymore. Hopefully, there would be a spot where I could be certain the fall would instantly kill me. I was done. The ride had beaten me. I sat there, waiting for a chance to end this on my terms. That was all I had left. Eventually, up ahead, a tiny speck of light appeared. I gathered my strength, ready to end it. I sat up, getting my legs under me so I could jump as soon as we were clear. The sled burst out of the tunnel. The dim light of the full moon was enough to be momentarily blinding after the pitch black of the tunnel. I gave my eyes a moment to adjust. I was back in a normal-looking Appalachian forest. Rolling hills, green trees. The air smelled of pine again. I heard an owl hoot off somewhere. Slowly, I lowered myself back into a sitting position, in shock. At first, I refused to believe it, but the ride was slowing down. I held still, making sure my mind wasn't playing tricks on me. But no, the cheap plastic sled that had been my world for what felt like an eternity was slowing down. Up ahead, a structure was visible, peeking out from among the trees in the dim lighting as the sled moved down the track. It was the Alpine Slide building, the crappy fake red barn where I had boarded this cursed ride so long ago. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, sure it was either my mind or the cursed ride playing tricks with me. But the building stayed there. It grew closer and closer. The track leveled completely out. The sled slowed down more. Before I had the time to really come to terms with it, I arrived back at the building. The sled slowed to a stop, gently pumping against another sled parked on the track. I sat there for a few moments, gasping in great big gulping fear breaths, trying to assure myself the ride didn't have one last trick of its sleeve. I looked around. The place was empty, deserted. The overhead lights were still on, and the old Pepsi machine still glowed and buzzed, but the ticket booth was dark and empty, a metal gate pulled down over the ticket window. Suddenly, it hit me that I was free, and I practically leapt out of the sled and onto the platform. I immediately collapsed. My legs were jelly, and my head was spinning. I tried to stand up again and doubled over, dry heaving. Have you ever been out on a boat for a day and have that weird reverse motion sickness when you're back on solid land? It was like that times 100. My inner ear was literally pounding. All the motion had really done a number on it. I laid there for a few moments and eventually forced myself to stand up on my two wobbling legs. I looked around, a horrible certainty creeping into my mind that there would be no exit, no way off the platform, but to my relief, an exit turnstile, one of those full-height ones, was set into the fence that surrounded the ride property. I went through it and found myself back on the main road. The truck stop was still there, still open, but far less busy. My car sat in the same corner of the parking lot I had left it. I allowed myself one look back, just one quick one. The metal skeleton of the Alpine slide track sat there, dark and quiet, but otherwise normal. I stumbled, ran back to my car, dug the keys out of my pocket, and collapsed inside. When the door shut, I let out a primal scream, the tons of fear and confusion and anger all fusing into a single raw emotion. I screamed again and again. After a few moments, I felt like I was emotionally at least back to a place where I could act, although I wasn't sure yet what to do next. Not really knowing what to do, I cranked the car. The ARC had been on low when I shut off the car, and it came roaring back to life, and cold air blowing on me almost sent me back into a full-on panic attack. I fumbled with the climate controls until the air stopped blowing directly on me, then calmed down enough to turn the heat on, helping to get the chill out of my bones. There was a half-full bottle of water in the center console cup holder, and I grabbed it and chugged it. Nothing ever tasted as good before or since as that few ounces of water. That was when I noticed the clock on the radio head unit. It was 4:17 in the morning. It had been about 1:30 or so in the afternoon when I got on the accursed ride. Over 15 hours. I had been on the goddamn ride for over 15 hours. Over half a day. I just sat there, warming up, calming down. I was exhausted. I was dehydrated. I can't even describe how my head felt. I probably had at least a minor case of hypothermia. I thought about going into the gas station and asking for help, but what would I even say? And more than anything, I just wanted to get away from this place. And I just wanted to get away. I wanted to be nowhere near the damn ride. I put the Camaro in gear and pulled into the street, and in panic, I immediately slammed on the brakes. I was lucky there was no traffic on the road at that moment. The feeling of accelerating to just normal surface street speeds made me sick to my stomach. I gathered myself and very slowly accelerated the car, usually treated with a very heavy foot up to 30 miles an hour. Every time I tried to accelerate at a pace faster than old lady going to church, uphill, I would have a panic attack. I was okay once I was up to speed, but accelerating freaked me out after being on that ride. I drove about 30 minutes, putting some arbitrary amount of distance between myself and the coaster. Eventually, I made it back to where the twisty mountain road met back up with a major road that would eventually meet back up with the highway. After a few more minutes of driving, I saw the on-ramp for the highway. There was one of those big truck stop travel plazas and pulled in, parking right up at the door. I smelled like pee, and I can only imagine how I looked, but I didn't care. I kept a couple of emergency 20 seconds in the back of my wallet and spent it on the biggest bottle of water the store had, an overpriced bottle of eye drops, and a huge travel mug of coffee. The clerk looked at me as if he was expecting me to either drop dead or rob him the entire time. Back in my car, I downed the coffee. I put a few eye drops in each of my eyes and sat there as the caffeine took effect until I felt like I could make it back to my apartment. The sun was just coming up when I finally pulled out of the truck stop and got on the freeway. I slowly, very slowly, accelerated up to highway speed, put the Camaro in cruise control, and let the miles start to drift away. I turned on the radio. I needed to hear human voices. Every time my mind went back to what had just happened, I turned the radio up louder, eventually drowning it out with painful levels of rock music. I wasn't ready to think about it yet. Yes, looking back, I know I was just in denial. I finally made it back to the crappy little apartment I had off campus, a little 2-story walk-up studio. I let myself in and collapsed on the cheap couch. I was asleep before I even had the time to decide whether or not to do anything else. I woke up later that afternoon. I took a shower and ate a meal and didn't think about the ride. I washed the pee-stained filthy clothes I had been wearing and didn't think about the ride. I went back to class and didn't think about the ride. Every time I thought about the ride, I forced it out of my head. I'm sure this wasn't the most mentally healthy thing to do, but what can you say? I didn't forget about it. Don't be silly. This isn't the kind of thing you forget. One day, while looking up something else in the university's library, my curiosity got the better of me, and I looked up the Alpine slide. No website, but a few Google Map and Yelp mentions. None of them mentioned anything weird, certainly nothing even remotely like what I experienced. Near as I can tell, it closed sometimes in the winter of 2012. Life went on. I mean, that's what it does. The next day was a little better, and the day after that, a little better. And the day after that, a little better still. I met a nice girl, graduated, got married, got a nice house in the suburbs, got a dog, had a daughter, spent a lot of time happy and not thinking about being trapped on an endless Alpine coaster, and that was my life for many, many years after that. Until a few weeks back, when as a very different person I found myself driving a boring and safe mid-sized family SUV through those same mountains. My wife, Carol, 5 months pregnant, sat in the passenger seat, our 6-year-old daughter, Emily, in a booster seat in the back, and Max, our mixed breed mutt, next to her. It had been a nice, pleasant trip, driving back from visiting her folks. I hadn't thought about that fucking ride in so long. I barely registered that I was in the same general area until it was too late. Suddenly, I realized that Little Mountain Tourist Trap Town was only a few minutes down the road. I swallowed hard and gripped the steering wheel hard. Carol was looking out the window at the scenery, and Emily was deep into some kid's YouTube video on an iPad. I forced myself to keep my breath steady as we rounded the corner. The town was still there, sorta. Time had not been kind to it. The gas station was still there. At some point it had been bought out by Shell. The tourist trap shops were still there. One of them was now a vape shop. The diner was closed, the building looking like it sat unused for a long time. But of course, that's not what I cared about. I looked over at the site where the Alpine Coaster once stood. It was gone. The kitschy fake barn was gone. The site was just a bare concrete slab with a chain-link fence around it. Faded. No trespassing and for sale signs hung off the fence. A pile of old, decaying lumber that might have once long ago been part of the structure covered part of the old lot. No sign of the track remained outside of some old concrete support posts dotting the side of the mountain. I exhaled out a breath I hadn't even realized I had been holding in. Soon, the little town disappeared in my rear view mirror. About a half hour later, we stopped for gas. I pulled up to a gas pump across from a massive motorhome. Max stuck his head out the window and started barking at a little white dog, a toy breed of some kind, in the window of the motorhome. Carol and Emily immediately headed into the store to restock on snacks while I fueled up. I stood there, a half smile on my lips as Max barked and wagged his tail in an attempt to attract the attention of the other dog while I filled up the tank, said dog doing an admirable job of ignoring him. Right about the time I finished fueling up and cleaning the bugs off the windshield, Carol returned from inside the store, Emily in tow, arms filled with 2 full-sized bags of salt and vinegar potato chips and what looked to be a half-dozen individually wrapped pickles. I raised an eyebrow at the collection of food, but knew better than to question a pregnant woman's snack choices. Should we take Max for a quick walk? Carol asked. The travel plaza had a nice little gated dog walking area off to the side. Yeah, probably not a bad idea. He's been cooped up in the car for a few hours, I said. Max, upon hearing his name and the word walk, forgot about the other dog and upgraded from wagging his tail to wagging his entire body while making whining sounds and staring right at me. About this time, I became half aware that the big motor home next to us was pulling away. I didn't think much of it, outside of doing a quick automatic mental check to make sure Emily was well clear of the moving vehicle, but she was safely between me and our SUV, well out of the way. But that was when Emily looked behind me and cheerfully yelled, "Daddy, look, a roller coaster. Can I ride the coaster?" It's cliché as fuck, I know, but my blood went cold. I turned around slowly, certain in my knowledge that terrible old decrepit Alpine Coaster would be there, having just popped into existence to trap me again. That is not what I saw. Sure enough, there was a coaster there, one I hadn't noticed earlier, because it had mostly been blocked by the motor home. But there it was. It was even an Alpine Coaster. But it was not the same coaster I had encountered those years ago. That was immediately obvious. It was a small but modern and newish-looking setup with neon lights and a bunch of people. There was an actual building where you bought tickets and a little snack stand. "Daddy, can we go on the coaster?" Emily asked again. My mouth made motions, but no words came out. I glanced over at Carol, hoping she'd say we didn't have time, but to my horror, she smiled and said, "You know what? That does sound like fun. Daddy will take you while I take Max for a walk." My mind raced, trying to think of a way to get out of it. But Emily was already dragging me across the parking lot to the entrance. I patted my pocket, making sure my phone was in it. Every fiber of my being was screaming to run away. I walked through the line in the ticket booth while Emily bounced happily. We got into a two-seat plastic sled. This one was actually a lot nicer than the one my mind wouldn't stop thinking about. It had two nice cushioned seats, big grab handles, even a nice roll bar. The sled started up the track. I fought back the panic. I swerved my head around, keeping the building in my view. I was terrified of losing sight of it. We made it to the top, and Emily did a happy squeal as we started down the side of the mountain. My heart raced. Any second my mind told me we'd lose sight of the building, and then the ride would never end. The ride sped down the mountain. My mind tortured me with thoughts of not only going through it again, but seeing Emily go through it. The ride went around a big banking turn. Emily kept shouting happily. How long before Carol reported us missing, I wondered. Could I keep Emily calm? What if it lasted even longer this time? What if this time it never ended? And then we were back at the start of the ride. The same attendant who had helped us into the sled was helping Emily out. I stepped out. The attendant gave me a brief look but said nothing. I guess I looked a little wild-eyed. I was fine. Emily was fine. It had been a perfectly normal, fun ride. That was fun, Daddy. Thank you, Emily said. I forced a smile back. It was fun, I responded, hoping like I sounded like I meant it. I took Emily's hand and we walked back to the car. Max saw us coming and barked happily. Carol looked up from the pint of Ben & Jerry's she had somehow acquired and added to her snack collection while we were gone and smiled at us. Did you have fun? She asked. It was so fun, Mommy, Emily said. Carol smiled down at her, but then looked at me and frowned. Are you okay? Carol could read my face a lot better than the attendant could. You're pale, I smiled, and this time the smile felt real. Ya know what? Yeah, I think I am okay. Carol looked a little puzzled, but didn't press it. We loaded Emily back in her booster seat, stopped Max from trying desperately to eat half a discarded gas station hot dog off the ground, and got him back in the car. Carol and her small collection of snack food took her place in the passenger seat, and I got in the driver's seat. I smiled. I cranked the car. I put it in gear. I pulled out of the gas station and back on the road, this time accelerating just a little faster than I had in years.